Hello students. Hello ma'am. So here we are today to discuss about what are the different types of textured yarns or the fancy yarns we have. As I told you, a single yarn can be a fancy yarn, a ply yarn also can be made into a fancy yarn as well. So here I have certain yarns which I can show you as well about how the yarn looks like when it is made into a fancy structure. So when we take about the first single yarn, say for example, so as you see here, you can see a yarn where it is thicker in certain areas and thin in certain areas. So mostly this slub yarn is made from staple fibers, and it is a single yarn where fibers are spun into a yarn, but in spinning what is done is, here at one point where the yarn looks very thin, there the twisting is good enough, whereas the place where you see the thickness, the yarn twist is low and very loosely twisted. So as you see around, you can see this irregularity as at equal regular interval. So these fancy yarns, as I told you earlier, are irregularly made at regular intervals. So this is one of the example for the slub yarn. This is a single yarn made out of staple fibers only. Then coming to the flock yarn, there is one more yarn called the flock yarn, where it is also a single yarn. While twisting, what is done is a little of colored fiber is introduced. Maybe they take 3 colors or 4 colors and introduce at regular intervals when the twisting is being done. So what happens is, it looks like an additional fiber on the surface of the yarn, giving it a look of flock. So tweed example I told you is one of the example that is done on this type of a yarn. Then we have also a thicker and a thinner yarn, where the yarn, these thick and thin yarns are also single yarns, mostly made by the filament fibers. The filament fibers, you know, they are spun through the spinneret. So when they are being spun through the spinneret, the force with which the yarn comes through the spinneret, this may not be a true example to make you or give you an idea, I have just got this, but when it is being extruded, then you can see that it is forcibly extruded, and so you get a slightly thicker area. When the force is slightly reduced, you get a thinner area. So in the manufacturing process itself, you get this yarn which is both thicker and thinner places. So this type of yarn you see in the thicker and the thinner one. And then coming to the complex yarns, all these are single yarns, that is, once the fiber is spun, we are getting this yarn. But coming to the complex yarns, where you have 2 or more yarns sometimes, we have different categories, and this is not a small list. There is a lot of exhaustive list that you can see for the fancy yarns, but as of what we see naturally, and we come across, these are the general fancy yarns that we generally come across in the market as well. So this is one complex yarn. You can see this is called the chenille yarn, where it is like a caterpillar. So when it actually is twisted, the best example which I can give you for this is making a garland. You know, when flowers are made into a garland, they are actually woven in one pattern, but once you leave it, it twists around and then makes into a huge garland type with no identification of where and how it has been done. Similarly here, if you untwist this, you can see the yarn which is being short fibers which are put between the 2 yarns and then locked up in between. So, this is one of the complex yarns where we are using more than one yarn at a time. And we have one more yarn here called the spiral yarn. So, you can see in fact two colors here, one is a little shaded brown and the other is a little darker brown. So, when you see, you can see some ups and downs in the yarn throughout. So, this is the cause where we have two yarns in this. One is supposed to be a thinner yarn. If we unravel it, we can make out one to be a thinner yarn like that of a thread, and the other yarn which is not given any part of twist. So, when these two are combined, naturally one is thicker and one is thinner, and so we get a spiral arrangement like this called the spiral yarn as well. So, this is the spiral yarn from the complex yarn. And then we have the Baukel yarn, where we can see that in this fancy yarn we have three different yarns that are used. One, we call it as a base yarn, which actually is the yarn which gives the strength to the yarn, whereas we have a separate yarn which gives the effect. That means, effect is it is loosely put around this base yarn, and to put that effect yarn in place, because once you simply wind it very loosely, it would fall down. So, to keep it in position, we have an other yarn which binds it, called the binder yarn. So, there will be three parts in this, where you can see one will be the base yarn in the center. There are actually two yarns here. One is a yarn of metallic thread and one a looped one combined. These are only two yarns in this. In a Baukel, to give an example, so if suppose this is the base yarn, the effect yarn is wound around this in a very loosely fashion, and one more yarn to keep that in position. So, that is the Baukel yarn. And the other we have is the Retinay yarn. So, in the Retinay yarn, the loops are smaller compared to the Baukel yarn. The only difference is that between this Retinay yarn and the Baukel yarn. So, actually in Baukel or the Retinay yarn, we require two steps. One is to create the base and the effect yarn, and then the binder yarn over it. So, in two steps these fancy yarns are generally prepared. So, as I told you earlier, these fancy yarns can be used for weaving purpose, or it can be very easily used for knitting purpose as well, but for weaving they have to be used only in the weft direction of the fabric and not at all in the warp direction of the fabric. That care has to be exercised, because these are very fancy yarns, they do not have much strength like that of ordinary yarns. So, we were while discussing I just told you that the yarn size is also very important, because there are thin yarns, thick yarns. So, one should understand what is the role of the yarn, what is the thickness of the yarn, and how it would affect the fabric also, because thin yarns naturally would give a fabric which is very thin, light in weight sometimes, whereas thicker yarns would give a fabric which is thick enough. So, one should also understand about the count of the yarn here. That means, the fineness of the yarn is called as the count of the yarn. So, it is the relation between the length and weight of a yarn. So, there is a fixed system where we call a direct system, we call an indirect system, where in the direct system we keep the length as constant, and whereas in the indirect system we keep the weight as constant while measuring the yarn. So, indirect system mostly would be for the spun yarn. You already know what is a spun yarn by now, the staple yarn, and the direct system would be for the filament yarn. So, in the indirect system we call the cotton count, the count system is there, which indicates that if 840 yards of cotton yarn weighs 1 pound or 1 lb, then we call it as 1 count. If the count has to be 2, for example, say if the yarn count is 2, if somebody says 20s count, for example, you must be hearing about the count of the yarn as 80s, 100s and all that. So, that means you have to multiply that with 840 yards of yarn, and then if that weighs 1 pound, then it is 20s count. So, what does it indicate to us? It indicates that higher the count, finer is the yarn, because if it is 1 count, only 840 yards would weigh 1 pound, we call it 1 count. If it is 20 count, then 20 to 840 yards of cotton yarn has to be weighed, which will weigh only 1 pound. That means, you have to take a very thinner yarn to have that length. So, higher the count, thinner is the yarn in the indirect system. Mostly we use for all the natural fibers, that is wool, linen, cotton, all these we use only the count system or the cotton system. And coming to the direct system, which is mostly used for only filament yarns, where we keep there the length constant and the weight keeps varying, unlike the count system where the weight is constant and the length varies. In the direct system, the length is constant, but the weight varies. So, we have around 9000 meters as a constant length. If it weighs 1 gram, then we call it as 1 denier. In their indirect system, the filament yarn is counted as denier. So, denier is 9000 meters. If it weighs 1 gram, then we say it is 1 denier. Now, there is also certain problems associated with the count system, because we know cotton, we said 840 hanks, for woolen it is different, it is 560, for rayon it is different, for especially those agro based fibers like jute, hemp, all these fibers, they actually are given different lengths. So, there is a lot of confusion over the different parts of the country and different parts of the world as well, where the count system may not hold good for every place, because it is not 840 yards which is standard everywhere. So, what they have come to consensus that there is an international organization for standardization, where they said that instead of having a count on denier system, one for filament yarn, one for cotton system and all that, instead let us have one common system called the TEX system. So, this TEX system would say that if 1000 meters, either it be a staple yarn or it be a filament yarn, if it weighs 1 gram, then it is 1 TEX. So, it is designated as TEX only. So, 1 TEX. So, this has removed the total confusion of what is the difference between a staple yarn and a filament yarn, whereas we have to use a count system, where we have to use a denier system and all this. And of course, there are also people who follow all the 3 systems, and there is also a method of calculating. When you have a count system, you can calculate that into a denier system. When you have a denier, you can calculate that into count and also into the TEX. So, there are some common factors which can be used for calculating the yarn for getting these different systems. So, but as far as this is concerned, you have to remember that in the count system, higher the count, thinner the yarn. In the denier system, higher the number, thicker is the yarn. It is opposite of the count system. So, one has to decide for which count we require. When we take a very transparent fabric, we know that it has to be invariably be woven with a thinner yarn, because to make it look transparent enough also, it has to be thin. So, deciding upon what count you are going to use, you can decide what is going to be the end use of the fabric. Thicker yarns cannot be used for fabrics which we use for apparel purpose. They are used for sheetings, they are used for pillows, all the household materials and all that. But finer materials, you know, you have seen a chiffon material, yes, you have seen a georgette material. Are they not different from each other? It depends on the count, it depends upon the type of fiber that is used. It also depends upon the amount of twist also that is given. As I told you earlier, we have also another classification where we can decide what is the amount of twist that has to be given to the yarn. And this amount of twist again would differ for us depending upon the end use of the fabric, for which end use I want the fabric for. You know, voile fabrics are very thin, transparent, as I told you, and they are very light in weight. The end use is a fabric for apparel purpose, isn't it? So, a sheeting material is thick, it can be used for a bed sheet, you cannot use it on your body as well. So, a drapery fabric, that is a curtain fabric, it has a certain amount of twist that is given, a certain amount of thickness for the yarn to give that heaviness. Heaviness is required in a drapery fabric, because when you hang a drapery, it should not fly, it should not open out, it should be actually giving a structure to the window. So, you require thicker yarns there, and there is also a possibility when the yarn is made more twist, the yarn becomes thinner and thinner, and the twist also cannot be given more than what is required. It in fact breaks the yarn into pieces. So, based on the twist also we can classify the yarns on the amount of twist. You must have seen the fabric that is present in the spectacle cases, you know, your glasses you have, the spectacle cases, when you touch it, it is so soft. It is also a cotton fabric, and you can see the voile, if I said a 2 by 2 fabric or a 2 by 1 fabric. Is there a difference in the texture when you touch them? Certainly there is a difference. The same weave is there, we call it a plain weave. A plain weave is present in the spectacle case fabric as well as other fabrics also, but to touch there is a difference. Why this happens is because they give a type of finishing to the fabric which makes the short fibers that are present in the staple yarn to come out onto the surface, creating that effect on the surface. So, for that purpose, if you want to pull out the yarns from the yarn that is already made, then that means that yarn should be loosely twisted. If it is very heavily twisted, you can't pull out the fibers in the finishing process. So, that is one of the reason where the end use, if they want a fabric to be a flannel material, a children's sleeping wear is also flannel material. So, in such a case what happens is, the yarn before it is manufactured, they give from the weaver's side, they say that this yarn is going to be made into a fabric meant for flannel. So, that means the yarn twist is very, very low there. We call it as a low twist yarn, a medium twist yarn, a high twist yarn as well as a voile twist yarn also. A low twist yarn is where we give only 2 to 3 turns per inch. We call this in short also as TPI, that is turns per inch. So, in turns per inch, so for 1 inch of yarn, if you have only 2 to 3 turns, then we call it as a very low twist yarn. So, such yarns when they are used in a fabric, it is very easy in the finishing operation to pull out the short fibers from the surface, which creates that flannel or the fluffy effect on the surface, a very smooth textured effect. Similarly, we have a yarn called as medium twisted yarn, where the medium twisted yarns are mostly seldom used for apparel purpose mostly, but there is a yarn where it is made with more than 2 to 3 turns per inch called as an average twist yarn. And then we have another type of yarn called the voile twist, where they use around 30 to 40 TPI, that means 30 to 40 turns per inch. 1 inch, you can see the number of spirals would be so many in that yarn. So, such yarns are also mostly used for apparel purpose. And we have the last section called the highly twisted yarns or the crepe yarns. The crepe fabric is an example for this. The twist is so high that it goes to even 80 turns per inch. So, when 80 turns per inch are given, you know what happens is when the yarn is given more twist and when you leave it slightly, you can see there is a crinky thing that happens and it would start circling on itself. So, that crinky yarn is the resultant of the crepe yarns, which are twisted purposefully for this purpose, and then when they are put onto the loom and is woven into a fabric, then you can see after the fabric is removed from the loom, you can see that crinkiness in the fabric as well, which gives the pebble surface on the surface. So, the pebbly surface is because the yarns are given a very higher twist and then woven into a fabric. So, as we have seen a fabric that can be napped, that can be used for weaving purpose, for especially apparel fabrics and for special fabrics like that of the crepe fabrics as well. And also how much of twist to be given. So, what is the criteria of which yarn has to be given what type of twist? So, there are three factors which would depend. One is the amount, the type of fiber that is present in the yarn, the end use that is required and the type of twist that is required. So, if we take the yarn as I told you for the napping purpose, you know it has to be a low twist. There are fibers which cling very easily to each other or the cohesiveness will be very high. There are fibers which the cohesiveness is low. For such fibers you need to give more twist. So, the fibers also play a role in deciding about the amount of twist. The fabric performance which is required in further use also will decide upon the amount of twist that is given. And one more aspect that has to be considered here is while twisting the yarn, we have to see whether we are using two types of twists. We have one is the S type of a twist and the other is a Z type of a twist. So, when you hold the yarn upright position, when the spiral arrangement falls in the direction of the central part of letter S, you know S is written in this direction. So, if the spirals are arranged from the left hand upper to the right hand lower side, if the spirals are in that direction, we call it as an S twist. And the opposite is the Z twist, where the central letter part of the Z letter is in the upper right to lower left. So, if the spiral arrangement is in that direction, then we call it as a Z twist. So, both the twists, why are they present is when we are using in weaving purposes especially, there when we try to combine the Z and the S twist, certain weaves look even more brighter and the effect is very clearly visible. But as usually for warp yarns, we can see the Z twist is mostly used than even the S twist of yarn. So, for weaving purpose only Z, and when they are combining the yarns, twist on twist they say. So, there are many factors that are utilized because we have a plain weave, a twill weave and a satin weave. So, for the weaves to be very prominent enough, the combination of the yarns are taken care of, and so for this reason we have both the S type of a twist and as well as a Z type of a twist. So, we have seen that yarns can be classified under different headings present on the number of parts, based on the length of the fiber that is used, based on the similarity, based on the amount of twist, based even on the type of a twist, that is S type or even Z type. So, apart from all this, we have a separate section where we are concerned about the thinness or the thickness of the yarn called as the yarn count. So, that is about the yarn, its types, its classification and how they behave when a fabric is woven from these types of yarns.
Ma'am, you have said us about the yarns, different types. What is mean by 2 by 2 fabric?
Okay. So, 2 by 2 fabric is a fabric where the warp and the weft contains 2 ply yarns. So, if you simply ravel out the yarn, when you remove the yarns warp direction, weft direction, and try to remove again yarn and then see the parts, you can see 2 parts used for the warp yarn and 2 parts used for the weft yarn. That is the reason why it is called as 2 by 2. So, it is a true one. So, if you want to test the fabric in the market also, this is one of the simple tests where you can do. So, 2 by 2 yarn is costlier compared to 2 by 1 yarn. So, this is one simple test which you can make and then understand about it.
Ma'am, I have a doubt about the fancy or a textured yarns, whether if they are used in weft direction, what about the strength of the fabric?
Yeah, true. So, as I told you, this is only to create a texture. So, fancy yarns also are made on the same spinning method, but the problem is here where the strength is slightly lower compared to the warp yarns. So, that is the reason why you cannot push them or you cannot stretch them on the loom. So, they have to be always in the weft direction, and the strength is slightly sacrificed when you use a lot of fancy yarn. So, you can see even in fabrics the fancy yarn mostly will be used here and there to create that effect. Yeah. So, thereby the compensation can be done, the strength compensation is done there.
Just now told about fibers, ma'am. So, staple and filament fibers, how do they combine, ma'am?
Combine to make a yarn?
Yarn.
Yeah, right. Because the staple fibers are short length already, they are processed on the mechanical spinning to give a yarn, whereas a filament yarns, they are longer lengths. So, when they want to combine both filament yarns and the staple yarns together, they have to cut the length of the filament yarns to that of the staple length. So, if cotton staple is to be combined with polyester, the yarn, the fiber that comes from the spinneret is cut down to the length of the cotton. Both of them are mixed up in the fiber stage and then processed on the mechanical spinning to get a yarn which has both cotton and polyester also in it. So, it has to undergo the same process of mechanical spinning. So, by that you can combine any type of filament yarn with any type of, any type of fiber can be combined there, short and long, which has to be cut down. The same length has to be maintained while they are processing it. So, thereby you get a yarn which is almost like a cotton like, wool like we say. So, that is more apt when we process them in the mechanical spinning.